Hi guys, today we're looking at this 2016 Vauxhall Insignia. It's a 1.6 CDTI, and the problem with this one is that we are getting an engine management light on. So we're seeing the engine management light on, we're also seeing the message service vehicle soon. Now this doesn't necessarily mean it's due a service, it does indicate that there's a problem there, and we're seeing engine power is reduced. Now that is referring to the limp mode. Basically the RPMs are reduced, and I think the maximum RPM is about 2,500 RPM, which does make it difficult to drive, especially if you're starting off on a hill or something like that. It's difficult to get going at all. Now the code on this, I've looked on my scanner, and the code that we're getting is P2598, and the description of that code is Turbocharger Vane position performance low position. Now when it mentions the turbocharger vane position, that is referring to variable geometry turbo, where depending on what the actuator is set to on that turbo, it can alter the performance of the turbo. So a low AR to a high AR, it's effectively making the turbo appear as though it's a small turbo, and then when the actuator is moved, the geometry changes in the turbo, and that's what's referring to as the vanes. The vanes basically move position inside the turbo, and it can effectively become a larger turbo. So it's meant to reduce lag. The smaller setting is good for low RPM, and it builds boost quickly, and then when it moves position inside, the turbo then appears as though it's a larger turbo and can produce more boost at higher RPM. Before we open the bonnet and look into this a bit further, I'm just going to take you back to the bench, and we'll just have a quick look at what components are involved in the turbo boost system. We start off with a vacuum source. Now, so in the case of older cars, the vacuum source was always taken from the inlet manifold, but with modern cars, turbo cars, the pressure in the manifold can become positive, therefore not vacuum anymore. So you need to have a vacuum pump for that vacuum source. And that can be a mechanical pump or an electric pump. The mechanical ones are usually on the camshaft at the top of the engine, or they are driven from the auxiliary belt via a pulley at the front of the engine. In the case of this Insignia, it's within the sump, the oil sump at the bottom of the engine. And these mechanical pumps are lubricated with oil, so having it in the sump makes sense, I guess. It's difficult to get to if we want to change that pump, if there's a problem with it, so hopefully that's not the issue here. The electric pumps are a lot easier to get to, and in fact, if it turns out that it's the pump on this vehicle, I may just add in an electric pump, because the electric pumps are really easy. They just need 12 volts and it generates that vacuum. But let me just quickly run through these components which is involved in this system. So as I said, we've got a pump. So let's just quickly draw that out. And this is the vacuum pump. Next, we have the boost control solenoid. So this is the boost control solenoid, and these are connected via rubber tubes. This is the vacuum source, so it's coming this way. Got the pump into the boost control solenoid, and then that then carries on to the actuator. Again, a rubber tube here. And the actuator has a metal rod coming out of it with some kind of linkage at the end, and this will connect to the variable geometry turbo. So let's draw that in. And what happens is this metal rod moves in and out and controls this turbo, basically changes the geometry of it, and in doing that will create more or less boost on demand. So this rod, when it moves outwards, it will create more boost, and when it moves inwards, it would be less boost. So we'll just draw that in. Less boost, and then when it moves this way, we've got more boost. Okay, so that essentially is our system. The ECU will control this boost solenoid. So ECU will have a signal into the boost control solenoid to control what this is doing. There is also going to be a sensor which is attached to this, and the ECU will monitor this data stream from this sensor. And then there's also another sensor after the turbo. So if we draw the air stream after the turbo, there will be another sensor here. This is the boost sensor. And again, the ECU will monitor that data stream. So we've got the vacuum pump generating the vacuum, which feeds the boost control solenoid. Basically, this is just a variable switch, if you like, to determine how much vacuum gets through that solenoid to the actuator. And then the actuator is a mechanical transducer which changes vacuum pressure to a mechanical movement in this rod, which physically changes the turbo and generates more or less boost. So the code that we're getting, P2598, is actually saying that there's a issue with this sensor is reporting back how much this actuator has moved, and it's saying that the sensor is reading low, as in the ECU has told the boost control solenoid to operate the actuator, but the sensor from the actuator is reporting back that it's not moved as much as expected, and that's what this code is for. So when you first start the car, there'll be no boost, and this actuator will be at its minimum position, less boost, and the sensor will read pretty much 0. So when you first start the car after clearing the code doesn't report a problem because it's reading what it should be, 0. But as soon as you start driving the car and boost is required, the boost control solenoid will operate the actuator, which should make more boost, but the sensor here is telling the ECU that this hasn't moved enough, and then it throws the code up, puts the car into limp mode. Now, I'm not sure what this sensor is actually for. I don't think it's needed because you've got a boost sensor here. The ECU actually knows how much boost is getting generated, and it can control the boost solenoid. So in my mind, all it needs to do is, if it wants more boost, it lets more vacuum through the control solenoid, and then it just monitors how much boost is made and keeps controlling this until it gets the desired boost. I don't see the point in actually knowing what happens in between, whether this rod, how much is moving. It doesn't really need to know that. But that's what it is. So with the code 2598, the items that can be faulty are either, number one, the sensor. Could be a faulty sensor. This might be moving correctly, but the sensor might be misreporting that. The second thing it could be is the actuator itself, so that the boost control solenoid is letting the vacuum into the actuator, but it's not working, it's not moving enough, and the sensor is actually reporting correctly. It could be the boost control solenoid, so the ECU is sending the signal to the boost control solenoid to let more vacuum through, but this might not be doing that. It might not be letting enough vacuum through or any vacuum to the actuator, so this might not be moving. Or the last thing it could be is the pump not generating any vacuum in the first place, in which case none of these components after this are going to operate correctly. Now, what I've done so far on this car is check the actuator and the sensor, and I've done that by taking this part, the sensor and the actuator, out of the car, plugging it back in to the connector, and then using my scanner, I've looked at the data stream from this sensor as I manually pulled this rod out and in of the actuator, just to test if the sensor was working properly. And in doing that, I can get it to change from 0% to 100% by manually pulling this rod out. So that tells me that the sensor is working correctly, because it can detect 0 to 100%. The second thing is the actuator itself. So when it's in the car and I start the car, as I said, it starts off at 0%. When I put my foot down and rev the engine, I can get it to go up to, I think it was about 85% on this sensor. So I know that this rod is moving out at least to 85%, because the sensor reports that. Now, 85% might not be enough. Maybe it is 100 it requires. So it's possible that this is still the problem. Don't know yet. What I've done is order a boost control solenoid. That is the next thing that I'm going to change here. So I've put this actuator and sensor back in the car, and what we're going to do now is change this boost control solenoid and give it a try. I'm hoping it's not the pump, because the pump is the most difficult part. As I said, it's in the sump, so I either take the sump apart, drain the oil, replace the pump, or I could disconnect that pipe and route in a new electric pump of my own and plug that into the vacuum source, which I think is going to be easier than replacing this pump, but hopefully it's not the pump that's at fault. So what I'm going to do now is replace this boost control solenoid, and we will give that another try. This is the 1.6 CDTI engine. Model number of this is B16 DTH. And all I've done here is remove the plastic vanity cover off the top. The pipes where the vacuum pipe comes out the sump around the back side of the engine. So I'll put a picture up on the screen. And basically what happens is the vacuum comes out at the bottom of the engine. So that's the actual pumps in the sump, as I said. And then that vacuum pipe, that silver vacuum pipe, comes out, goes up the back of the engine. Then it transfers to a rubber pipe. And then that pipe comes along and goes into the boost control solenoid. So the boost control solenoid has two ports on it. Input port from this vacuum pipe, and then the other port, the red arrow, that comes around the side of the engine. It's underneath there, you can't see it, and then ends up here, this silver pipe here. So there's a rubber pipe there, goes into a silver pipe, comes along, down, and into the actuator, which is this bit down here. So just below that, there's the actuator. And this rod here, this silver rod coming up, this is what moves in and out on the actuator when the boost controller operates it, and it moves this lever. You can see I can move it here manually. That lever is attached to the turbocharger, which is under this cover. So I've already tested this actuator, taken it out of here and manually adjusted this rod, and we can see on the sensor output on my scanner that it seems to be correct. I'm able to move this full-scale deflection, so 0 to 100%. So I'm guessing that the actuator is okay. The next thing to check is going to be the boost control solenoid, which I have, but that just needs fitting in. Now, it is a bit tricky to get to. It's basically here, just around the back where I'm pointing, just there. So there is room around the back of the engine to get to it. It's just a bit tricky, but you've just got those two rubber pipes and the electrical connector, and then there's two bolts that need undoing, and we can change that out. So that's what I'm going to try next. I fitted the new boost controller. This is the old one. It's exactly the same part number. And unfortunately, it didn't fix the issue. So I cleared the code, took the car out, and for the first couple of pulls, there was boost there. It was working normally. But then I think after the second pull, the engine light came on and there was reduced power again. I looked on the codes and it was the same code number. So this hasn't fixed it. So I don't think it's the actuator, although it could be. I don't think it's the sensor, because we've tested that. The sensor on the actuator, I mean, it's all in one actually. I keep referring to the sensor as a separate item, but it is all connected. The sensor is on the back. The sensor is part of the actuator. So I don't think it's that. Bought this vacuum gauge from Amazon. I'm going to use this to help locate this vacuum problem. So this gauge actually reads positive pressure as well as vacuum. And you can see there's a couple of markings on there that indicate possible problems with the engine when the vacuum is low. Now this is primarily for older engines where the vacuum source is taken directly from the inlet manifold. But you can see here one says late valve timing is perhaps the issue if it's between 0 and 10. This is inches of mercury. It's an old scale. But that's what the IN/HG means, inches of mercury. Between 0 and 10, it's saying it's possibly late valve timing. Then we've got late ignition timing if it's between 14 and 17. And the normal area, this green one here, is between 17 and 22. So when I connect to the vacuum source, this is where I would expect the needle to be. What we'll do is we'll test it before the boost control solenoid. So as soon as it comes out of the pump, the vacuum source, we'll plug it straight into here and we'll see what that's making. I took a video of the vacuum gauge readings with the engine running. It was a bit noisy, I couldn't really talk over it. So this is the video that I took. I plugged it into the vacuum source before the boost control solenoid, started the engine, and as you can see it's very low, between, well, less than 5 on the scale. Now the interesting thing is when I rev the car, it's still low until it reaches a certain RPM, and then it suddenly jumps up to the normal position, or even just after. So you can see that there. So it's very low at low revs, and then at a certain RPM, I think it was about maybe 3000 RPM, maybe a little bit less, it suddenly jumped up to normal position. I'd expect if there was a leak somewhere, it would just be low all the time. The fact that it jumps up suddenly to normal position, that is very odd. So I'm going to have a little look around and see what that is. So the vacuum pipe that supplies vacuum to the boost control solenoid, that comes from the sump, the bottom of the sump from the pump, up the back of the engine, and it goes into a small T, plastic T in that rubber tubing. One side goes to the inlet of the boost control solenoid to feed that with the vacuum, and the other side comes via a little rubber pipe this way. And let me see if I can show you. I have moved the ECU pack out of the way just to give a bit more access, but it's this device here, just there. I don't know what it is, but the rubber pipe comes along underneath, plugs into the bottom side of it, and then there's another rubber pipe here, which I'm guessing is the outlet, and that goes into this device here. Again, I'm not sure what that one is either just yet, but the pipe on this device, the output of this pipe, is snapped off. So there should be a little plastic pipe that this rubber tube pushes onto, and it's snapped, and the rest of it is still in the rubber tube. So I'm pretty sure this is going to be the source of our vacuum leak, which is why it can't keep that vacuum. So what I'll do is I'll take this off. Maybe we need to replace this, or maybe I can fix it. Maybe glue another outlet on there. Let's get this off, get it on the bench, and we'll take a look. That faulty part, the part with the cracked pipe, this is it, off the car, and you can see there's the inlet at the bottom. Rubber pipe pushes on there, and there should be the similar one there, but it's snapped off. And this is part of the EGR system. Basically it recirculates a portion of the exhaust gases back through the intake instead of using fresh air. And I'm not really sure what the advantage of that. I think it's something to do with emissions. The part that's broken is the vacuum regulator. So this picture here, this shows you those two components in the car. So the one on the right is the vacuum regulator. This is the part that's broken. And then that then connects to another rubber tube to the item on the left, which is part of the EGR valve. So that's the bit that allows the exhaust gases back into the inlet. There's a little diagram here just to show you what I'm talking about. So this diagram, the vacuum source is from the intake manifold. You can see there that yellow pipe, that's the one from the intake. Now mine isn't on the inlet, it's connected to the vacuum pump in the sump. So that's the only difference on this diagram. So the vacuum source comes along that yellow tube into the bottom of the vacuum regulator, which is this part that's broken. And then the blue pipe comes out of there and into the EGR valve. So what that's doing is the vacuum regulator is basically a switch. It's just switching on and off, or allowing that vacuum on and off through that port, and that in turn then switches the EGR valve. Now, in terms of why the vacuum gauge was reading low and then it read high when there was some higher revs on the engine, that kind of makes sense now, because the EGR valve is set to open under a few circumstances. One is when the engine's warm, when it's idle, and at low speeds. So at low RPM and idling, this valve will be open because the EGR valve needs to be open. So this is open, allows the vacuum through to the EGR, and with this being broken, when this is open, the vacuum is just escaping to air here. Well, actually the vacuum won't be escaping, it'll be sucking air in through here. But that will happen at low RPM and at idle. Then under high load and full throttle, the EGR valve closes. So this will then close. Now as soon as this is closed, this will stop the leak because that port here won't be open anymore. So as soon as you press the full throttle, this valve closes, the vacuum returns, and when I took it out the other day for a couple of pulls, it seemed okay for those first two pulls, but then the engine then detected that it had the leak and low vacuum, and it threw the code up and threw it into limp mode. So I think this is all it is. I've ordered one of these online, so what I'll do is I'll wait for that to arrive, I'll fit it, and then we can do a final test just to make sure that this has cured the problem. So everything's back together, and as you've just seen on that vacuum gauge, it's now reading a normal vacuum again. So whilst I don't expect many of you to have this exact problem, that particular bit of plastic snapping off, it is a valid video just to troubleshoot a vacuum problem. So anything that runs on a vacuum, and that's, in this case, it's the variable Vane actuator, but it could be a wastegate actuator on a turbo, or it could be the boost controller. Anything that's got a vacuum source to it, normally connected by rubber pipes, and the rubber pipes could be frayed or perished or split, and also the devices themselves in between could be faulty and causing a vacuum leak. Hopefully this video is of some use, and if you have a problem with a component that does have a vacuum source, don't immediately jump to the conclusion that it's that component that's failed. It's possible it's the vacuum source itself that's connecting these together. So start off where the pump is, trace the pipe along and just keep checking with the vacuum gauge, and you'll be able to trace where the problem is, hopefully. So thanks for watching. As I said, I hope you found it useful, and I will see you on the next one.